And cells are very important. They are probably the most important component of the body. Now, when similar cells group themselves together to create a like function, they create a tissue. So a tissue is a group of like cells that come together to create or to carry out a similar function. For example, muscle cells. They're all contractile, they'll come together, they'll make a muscle belly. Now, tissues, similarly, can organize themselves, right? Various tissues, that is, into an organ. So various tissues can come together to carry out differing functions. If we look at the heart, we have muscle cells which have come together to form the ventricles, okay? We have endothelial cells which have come together to line those ventricles. And each of those cell types or those different tissue types are going to help that organ carry out its function. And then organs are grouped into systems or organ systems, such as the cardiovascular system, which has the blood vessels along with the heart. Right? The neurological system, which is the neurons along with the brain tissue, and so on and so forth. And all of this works together to form an organism. Now, all of these are working together, none more important than the other. Okay? The lungs are bringing in oxygen. The heart is going to circulate that oxygen to the brain and to all the other tissues. The GI is doing what? Bringing in what? What does every other cell in your body need that the GI system helps to bring in? Your brain cannot function without it. I think I'm hearing it. Anyone? What do you eat? What's part of your diet? Question? Glucose, thank you. Glucose. So glucose is coming in through your diet, which is your digestive system, breaking down food, as well as your liver, right? And all of these systems are functioning together. Let's see how much time we have. Now there are four primary types of tissues in the body. There's muscle tissue, and muscle tissue is contractile. That's going to help us with movement. And we're going to study muscle tissues right after we study the integumentary system. Then there's nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is going to form the communication of electrical impulses that actually allows muscle to move, okay, as well as other body functions, such as the autonomic function, to be carried out. So it's going to carry the information along electrical impulses, and we've seen that a lot so far. Epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is lining body cavities. Okay, it's going to be that barrier protection, or that barrier between the outside world, such as your skin. It's going to line all your hollow organs. It's going to line your blood vessels. It's going to line your respiratory tract. It's going to line your GI. Remember, your GI is a hollow tube from mouth to anus. It's going to line that entire tube. It's going to line your reproductive system. It's going to line your urinary system. So bladder right through to your urethra. Okay, that's your epithelia. It's also going to form glands. And glands are important for secreting various enzymes, hormones, depending on whether it's endocrine or exocrine. And lastly, there's connective tissue. Connective tissue pretty much does everything else. It's a supportive tissue. It's going to also store energy. So lots of that fat that's underneath the skin in that loose connective tissue. It's going to cushion organs, as well as I said, store energy. So those are your four tissue types. Today, we're specifically going to focus on epithelial. Today and the rest of the next class. So we're going to list the functional and structural characteristics of epithelial tissues. Now, Epithelial tissue is classified based on the shape of the cells as well as the number of cells that are forming that layer. So if it's a single layer of cells, it's called a simple tissue or simple epithelium. If it's more than one layer of cell or more than a single layer, it's called stratified. Stratified. And we'll see how being simple or being stratified is going to lend to the function of that tissue. In some parts of the body, we want a simple epithelium. In some parts of the body, like the skin, we want more cells. We want it stratified. Now, tissue can also be classified based upon the shape of the cells. So if they're flat, they're called squamous cells. If they're cuboidal, so as tall as they are wide, they are cuboidal cells. And if they're tall cells, they are columnar cells. So if you put the number of layers together along with the shape of the cells, you'll get the name of that tissue. Okay? And again, there can be modifications to this as well. So we said a flat cell is called a squamous cell. We said a cell that is as tall as it is wide is a cuboidal cell. And we said a cell that is taller than it is wide with a more oblong nucleus is a columnar cell. Okay. Now, as a result, we can have a single layer of squamous cells. This is called your simple, because it's only one cell layer, squamous epithelium. We can stack these cells. All right. Now remember, the cells at the bottom can also change their shape, but this tissue is going to be named according to the shape of the cells at the top. So this is going to be stratified, squamous. Again, because this is more than one layer thick, and the cells at the top are squamous. You can have a single layer of columnar cells. This is simple columnar. Okay. And again, we can stack these columnar cells. This is stratified columnar. Now, columnar cells specifically, because of the way the places that they're located are associated with cilia, and we'll talk more about this. This is called cilia, along with goblet cells. And goblet cells produce mucus. Okay, I'll just write mucus. So one example of the location of columnar cells is along the respiratory airway. And we want mucus flowing along the respiratory airway. We want cilia to help. We want cilia to help brush that mucus along. Okay? All right. So as we said, some modifications can occur within columnar tissue, that is goblet cells, which secrete mucus, and cilia, which are those little hairs at the top of the cell that move material along. So let's wrap up by looking at some of the properties of epithelial tissue. So first of all, there's cellularity. What does cellularity mean? Cellularity means that we have cells lined up together, separated by minimal extracellular material. So there's not much else around them. You just have cell, next to cell, next to cell, next to cell. All right? Now they're anchored together by special junctions. So they're not just floating sloppily around. They're anchored together, and we'll talk about what those junctions are probably next time, but they're held together closely, okay, by special junctions. Now they exhibit polarity, and polarity means they have an apical surface, they have a basal surface, right? So they have an apical surface, they have a basal surface, and they have lateral surfaces. They're supported by connective tissue. So there's something underneath these cells that anchors them down. Now, as we said, epithelial cells are found lining body cavities. So for example, when we see it in the GI, there's the epithelial layer, but there's connective tissue underneath. And then there's a small basement membrane that anchors that epithelial layer to the underlying connective tissue. Okay, that's called the basement membrane. It's that small layer anchoring these cells to this underlying connective tissue. And the basement membrane is made up of two structures: the basal lamina, which is basically collagen, the basal lamina, and reticular fibers. And together, these are going to anchor or structurally support the epithelial cells on the connective tissue underneath. Now, epithelial tissue is avascular, meaning it does not have an active blood supply. It gets its nutrients from the underlying connective tissue. It does not have an actual active blood supply. Okay, but it is innervated. So the nerves from that connective tissue do reach up into the epithelial cells and innervate that tissue. So it's avascular, but it is innervated. And lastly, epithelial cells are very good at regenerating.